Good morning. I'm Bob Magna, president of the Rockefeller Institute of Government. I would like to thank everyone for joining us this morning for what is one of the Institute's most productive conferences. First and foremost, thanks go out to Lisa Parshall, because this event could not go forward without her extensive efforts. About today, almost from the beginning of the Rockefeller Institute, there has been a focus on the problems and challenges facing local governments. In my experience, which goes back further than I'd like to admit, almost 40 years in state and local fiscal policy, the most misunderstood or understudied side of federalism and fiscal policy is the local government side of the world. So I think that makes this conference even more important. And I look forward to today's presentations, much of which reflects ongoing research into important issues in local finance. Today's topics are typical of the research we have come to expect, and I look forward to the presentations. I should save this for the panel I'm moderating this afternoon, but we are living in unprecedented fiscal times. The state of New York has gone from a projected multi-year deficit in the billions of dollars to a current surplus in the billions of dollars and no projected deficits as far as 5 years into the future. And those changes have occurred in their projections in less than 24 months, in about a span of 18 months. The state has gone from projected multi-billion-dollar deficits to multi-billion-dollar surpluses. A lot of that, as the panelists today know, is the interaction of state and federal policies. And I'm curious to see how these rapid changes are impacting, what's going on with the finances and fiscal policies at the local level. So, as former budget director, I can say, really, we live in unprecedented times, but I probably could have said the same thing after 9/11, after the fiscal crisis that we faced in the Great Recession. And so it seems every 4 or 5 years, we run into another remarkable event which affects state and local fiscal policy. This is no exception what we're facing now, although I think the changes have occurred in a much more rapid fashion, as we talked about. And so it's a most unusual fiscal environment. And so I would say over the past half century. So again, it's important to hear from the researchers today about how these changes have affected the local government landscape. Now I'm going to turn the conference over to Lisa, and thanks again to everyone who's joining us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So good morning, everyone. I'm Lisa Parshall. I'm one of the fellows at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you once again for attending our 2022 Local Government Lab Conference. As noted, we have some of the leading researchers today and innovators in state and local politics research and a very full agenda. So our first panel this morning is Pathways and Corridors, Crafting Smarter Regional Policies. And this panel is all about building innovative infrastructure and building connections to foster smarter regional planning. So we have 4 presentations today. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers in order that they appear in the program. Each presentation will have around 15 minutes with some time allotted at the end of the panel for questions of audience and group discussion. So if you do have questions during the presentations, you can go ahead and enter that into the Q&A option, which I will monitor and bring to the speaker's attention when we enter the Q&A period at the end of our last presentation. Okay, so our first presenter today, and Kaitlin, if you want to go ahead and start your screen share. Our first presenter today is Kaitlin Whitney, who is an associate professor of science, technology, and society at the Rochester Institute of Technology and a fellow here at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. So her presentation today is on trade-offs in transportation right-of-way uses, Examples of US states exploring solar energy, agriculture, and pollinator habitat along roadsides. Thank you, Kaitlin.
Thanks so much for having me, Lisa. You gave me an accidental promotion. I'm an assistant professor, but I'll take it, hopefully in the future, right? Well, thanks all of you. I'm Kaitlin, and I want to first tell everyone what a roadside right-of-way is, because this is something that I spend lots of time thinking about and staring out the window about, but just to make sure everyone knows what I'm thinking and talking about. Highway roadside rights-of-way are areas that are actually next to the paved highway. So this is actually an example from my research here. We're along this nice divided highway here. And so roadsides are actually areas that are required to be incorporated into highway design. And so one of the reasons these areas are so exciting to think about is they're required to be here, but there's actually a ton of this land that not only states have, but also the interstate system and some regions have. So many state departments of transportation are actually some of the largest landowners in their state because of these grassy vegetated areas that run alongside highways. I do want to point out that this has emerged over the last century. So highway design in terms of standardizing what roadsides looked like didn't actually start really until the 60s. And in the 1970s, this zonal system was really standardized. And this zonal system includes what's known as a clear zone. And you can see it a little bit here in this picture that I've included. There's a vegetation transect tape that's running away from the camera. And that area off to the left that you can see that's more in grassy vegetation between these kind of flowers and the roadside is actually required, mandated to be in this clear zone that's kept as short vegetation. So when we're talking about these potential innovative uses, I do want to also start by pointing out that these areas exist mainly for safety reasons, to provide visibility for people, for example, so that a driver could see something like a deer coming, but also to keep these areas clear of things like trees or often utility infrastructure that is known as a deadly fixed object that could be dangerous to a vehicle leaving the roadway. Beyond that mandated clear zone, the right-of-way often includes more area that could potentially be used for other kinds of uses. There are a lot of external factors that are actually pushing states to be thinking about innovative uses for these spaces. So oftentimes they're seeded in grass, sometimes other kinds of vegetation, but now people are thinking about lots of really different things to do with them. And this is for really three big reasons. And in part, this ties to Bob's introduction about fiscal incentives and reasons. So many state departments of transportation are operating under federal fiscal planning requirements. And they're also concerned about not having enough revenue from previous ways of raising revenue, including fuel taxes, and thinking about even, for example, what might a future that has more electric vehicles mean if people are not then generating the same amount of fuel tax revenue, that the spending often for infrastructure is already outpacing their ability to generate revenue, and they're looking for innovative ways to raise revenue that can be used for transportation infrastructure. So they have in part turned towards these areas to view them as assets. How can we actually just try to extract more value out of these areas? What can we do with them? And really seeing them as a source of both cost savings for either the state agency itself or a way to more generally raise revenue for the state. And at the same time this is happening, ecologists and biologists are starting to not just think about all the damage that roads do to ecosystems and for potentially wildlife populations, but are starting to think about, can they actually be harnessed as corridors themselves? And the most, I would say now, famous example of this, infamous example, is the voluntary conservation agreement that's happening for monarch butterflies. So monarch butterflies were recently not added to the Endangered Species Act listing, but a series of state departments of transportation have voluntarily come together along with energy rights of way lands to say, we're actually going to use these spaces as conservation corridors. So there's a sustainability awareness, whether or not it's voluntary or required, to potentially use these spaces in innovative ways. Many states also have mandates or goals for their renewable energy portfolios. And so I'll be talking a little bit today about how these spaces might be used for meeting some of those state goals in particular. Okay. There's lots of room for states to innovate here. So even though there are requirements at the federal level, in part from the Federal Highway Administration, as long as states are meeting those federal requirements, there's lots of space that they have to think about what they want to do with these areas that they're required to have with this acreage that they do have. So for example, in New York State, we have over 100,000 acres in this right-of-way. So that's lots of land to potentially do things with, but there are some constraints on it. The Federal Highway Administration in particular is is really interested in energy uses, alternative energy uses potentially in this space. And I'll be speaking about 2 of those today, but there are lots of other potential uses of these spaces. So what I'm sharing today is ongoing work that's part of my Nathan Fellowship with the Rockefeller Institute. It's very much a work in progress, and I look forward to all of your feedback. And I'm sharing about 3 potential uses that are innovative, but there are many others that I'm looking at and that we could be talking about. All right, the first one I want to share about is solar in the right-of-way. And so what I'm showing here is a map of the states that I know of right now that have solar arrays in the highway right-of-way. And I want to be clear that some additional states have solar at rest areas or have solar on, for example, buildings that are owned by the Department of Transportation. But I'm specifically talking about, for example, ground-based solar arrays or states that are actually putting solar panels on their noise barriers that are running along the sides of the highways. And so this is something that several states are doing. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like, the state that's been doing this the longest is Oregon. They put in the first one of these, that's highway solar, in 2008. And so they've really been a model for many other states that are considering this. And so in the photo, you can see an area next to a divided highway that has a fenced off ground-based solar array. So they've been doing this now, and they were inspired by Germany, and seeing that Germany had this along the Autobahn, they wanted to figure out putting this in here. And there's lots of reasons why states might want to think about doing this. So 3 big ones are actually trying to generate revenue, so raise money themselves by potentially selling this energy to the grid, or actually use the power internally, cost savings in terms of running either their facilities buildings or potentially vehicles using this solar energy. Other states may want to use this as part of their renewable energy portfolio. There are many other potential benefits of solar, but these are 3 big ones for potentially states that are doing it or thinking about doing it. But there are also some challenges and constraints for thinking about this. For Oregon in particular, they've been very public about reflecting on what it took to make this project happen. And the upfront costs of putting in solar are really significant. This is also a challenge because many of the states have tax incentives for people who are putting in renewable energy projects, but the state agency doesn't pay taxes. So they had to set up a private-public partnership in order to figure out ways to access the benefits that would make this project happen fiscally. So that was a challenge for them. Other constraints that have come up are ones that think about either the local legal infrastructure and landscape, the state ones in terms of, for example, in Oregon, whether or not you're allowed to generate more power than you yourself would be using. Are you allowed to actually be selling that excess energy to the grid? And the Federal Highway Administration has actually created a guidance document for states interested in this. So they are interested in states doing this, but they want them to make sure that they're following still federal requirements for what's expected for both safety considerations and, for example, utility infrastructure in the right-of-way. This may be a way, though, knowing that this land is owned, for example, by the state in the context that I'm talking about, to put in renewable energy projects in spaces that they may not be feasible or actually permitted otherwise. And so one of the things that I keep finding in my research is how people are using the unique ownership difference of the right-of-way in context of the landscape around it to potentially do innovative things. All right, the next one I want to share about briefly is actually agriculture in the right-of-way. And this really encompasses right now 3 different things that I'm thinking about. So really, I've found 3 different kinds of agriculture that are happening in highway rights-of-way. The first one I want to mention is actually living snow fences. So this is really focused on departments of transportation and thinking about their mission being safety oriented for drivers, for passengers, for goods that are traveling. So many states actually have living snow fence programs that pay farmers or other landowners to maintain vegetation, knowing that research demonstrates that areas that don't have snow fencing there's more likely to be blowing winds and actually more accidents in the winter. So many of these Midwestern states actually pay farmers sometimes to maintain vegetation on their own property, but some of these states actually pay farmers to grow corn into the right-of-way, actually on the public land, and keep it there all winter. So the idea here is really a safety benefit, even though it has a cost for the state agency. Other states are actually harvesting the vegetation as biomass generation. So some states are actually basically haying the right-of-way. And we do again see more of this in the Midwest and sort of the Central Plains area. One innovative use that's really unique that I want to show you here from New York is actually an urban farm and community garden. So I have found only this one example of this so far, but there's actually a project here in Rochester, which is where I'm based, that's called 490 Farmers. And so it's actually using an interstate 490 right-of-way area that you can see here in this picture as a community garden and actually a fruit and nut forest. But one of the things I want to point out here is that there's a reason this project is really unique. So the road that's actually in this picture is not the interstate. The interstate is actually a sunken highway off down to the right. So it's physically lowered and fenced off. So there's lots of reasons why this may not be feasible in other places, but this particular project is really innovative because it's taking advantage of the fact that this is state land in a city landscape where actually there are policy constraints on setting up interannual leases for people who want to set up urban farms or gardens. So there's a great reason why they've targeted basically state land for their interest in this project, even though many areas around them where they might set up, for example, a similar kind of project on city land, it would not actually be feasible. But there may not be many examples of where this could transfer. Okay, so in general, why are states interested in farming in the right-of-way? Paying operations might actually be able to generate revenue, or they can actually convert, for example, switchgrass growing in the right-of-way into biofuel to actually run their vehicles. So this might save costs on fuel for the Department of Transportation. Safety is a big one, especially for those living snow fences. And in the case of that really unique urban farm, this is a food security issue in an inner city. So this is a really unique project, and I'll be looking for more examples of this. So if you know of any, please tell me. There are some challenging constraints of this, and I will point out from my own research that a lot of these agricultural uses in the roadside right-of-way are so new that there's not a lot written about this. But what we can look to is actually lots of literature on transmission right-of-way, energy right-of-way agriculture, which there's a lot longer precedent for in states in the US. So there are some health concerns. In a roadside context, this might be runoff or heavy metal contamination in the soil if you're actually eating food that comes out of a right-of-way. There are also, again, for those deadly fixed object concerns, concerns over what you can actually put into the right-of-way, things that you might want on a farm that you may not be able to use in this unique context. Zoning can be both an opportunity and a constraint. So for example, in Washington state, there's a right to farm law that actually might make it easier to allow local areas to say, hey, this is farming. We might be able to use our state legal landscape to say that we want to be able to use this independent of what kind of local zoning is happening. And there's some conversations in the city of Seattle about using city rights of way to put in more tiny pockets of urban agriculture. All right. The last one I want to talk about for today, and one thing that sort of surprised me, I guess, in my research, is that maybe it's so mainstream, it's no longer innovative, is pollinator plantings in the right-of-way. And so there's actually many different ways that state departments of transportation are thinking about creating pollinator habitat. And some of this has to do with how they're managing their vegetation, things like mowing. So I want to be clear that in this, what I'm talking about is actual non-grass plantings, things like wildflowers or planting prairie restoration type plants. And I was looking for which state departments of transportation are explicitly putting in novel kinds of plantings that, again, are not grass in their highway roadsides to support pollinators. And so far from what I've found, even if we're just including pilot projects, is that the vast majority of US states have at least one of these. And from looking at others of these states that don't yet have it, for example, my work looking at Wisconsin, I found that there's actually big public push to say, hey, we know lots of other states have this. And I found a petition that residents of Wisconsin have set up. They're actually lobbying their state transportation agency to do this. So in this case, there's been a lot of attention in recent years to the plight of insect pollinators in particular. And so this one actually seems to be widely adopted by many state agencies. All right, this is one example of this. Arkansas has what's known as wildflower routes. And so some states I actually did find are basically adapting things they already did, potentially for scenic byways or aesthetic purposes, and now realizing that there are pollinator benefits to them as well, and sort of labeling them as that also. All right, Why do states want to do this? Sometimes because the flowers are there, even if this is not a reduced mowing project, they're able to spend less money on mowing. And so that can be a savings. Some states are actually in this voluntary agreement. And so they're doing this for compliance reasons, or that they know that people are pushing for this. So many state departments of transportation have reported being contacted that this is something the public knows about, has an awareness about, and wants to see more of. There are also some challenges though. So any of these seed mixes cost more, right? So putting in things that are not grass adds a lot of cost to actually seeding that roadside. And so if states want to do this, for example, after a construction project, that would add cost for the contractor or whoever is paying that cost for that seed installation, or if it needed to be reseeded, depending on how it grew up. There's also perception challenges. So while some people are really excited for this, other people are not excited to see a shift from more of a grassy or turf aesthetic on the roadside to something that looks weedy potentially. So a lot of these projects have reflected on the need to sort of share with people what this might mean and what you expect to see in the roadside. Sometimes transportation, either officials or actual managers who are on the ground themselves, have their own concerns about perception. And so there have been concerns raised actually about safety. Will doing this to support pollinators and even tiny things like bees actually end up attracting other forms of wildlife that create their own safety concerns? So I will point out that so far the research from both the Federal Highway Administration and some small studies done by states have found that that's not the case, but definitely people want to know more in this area. And personally, I have a project that's working on that now. Okay, one of the challenges for all of these, though, even if all three of these sound really exciting, is that they're actually competing for the same areas. So most of these uses we just talked about want an area that's generally flat, that gets good sun exposure and has soft soil. So not, for example, a rocky outcropping. So this raises the question of how do states or local areas decide which of these uses to put into a space? They can't do all of them at the same time. They are actually competing for the same places. So I want to show you two examples of states that are trying to think this through and talk about where else states might be able to take a step back and think more holistically. Many of these states are using what's known as context-sensitive design, which is a transportation planning framework that's thinking about where and when different kinds of uses might be appropriate, thinking about who the stakeholders might be and what they want out of these spaces. So one example is that several years ago, Texas basically hired a firm to do an evaluation for them of how to extract more value. And so what I'm showing here are actually some screenshots from this assessment. It included things beyond rights of way, but specifically they were looking at who might be interested in different kinds of places and how might we consider 7 different criteria about the feasibility and the impact. And that's in that bottom quick screen grab. So thinking about the technical, legal, and economic feasibility, and then the impact in terms of public impact, environmental, or safety ones. But I will point out here that they identified some ways in which solar, or for example, pollinator plantings might be values they want to extract, but all of it assumes the economic and legal status quo. So this tool did not help people think, taking a step back, about what might be possible for the future in Texas, for example. A little bit later, back in 2013, Michigan did something a little bit similar where they actually developed a roadside suitability index. So the idea here was to say, we want to find the places in Michigan that might be best suited for one of these innovative uses, for example, renewable energy. And they came at it from a very different perspective. So I'm showing you here actually the list of 21 different criteria that they used to map the whole state and then think about which places might be best suited for different kinds of innovative uses. And so the 7 that are bolded at the top are actually the ones that they decided after this assessment were most important. What I want to point out about this is all of these are, I see Lisa's going to ping me, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thanks. So all of these are things that come from what we call land use land cover. And they're really specific to basically what kinds of vegetation and land use are in states. They don't consider, for example, those economic or legal frameworks. So the last thing I want to just say quickly is that there's a lot of room for states to take a step further back and think about what kinds of, for example, tax policies or renewable energy policies and incentives they have in place so that they can more broadly and holistically think about what kinds of innovative roadside uses they want to have for the future. And to remember that it's not just about extracting value from the roadside, it's also about thinking about, do they have that human capacity and resource capacity to support these if they're going to put them in? So the last thing I want to do quickly is say that there's more of these that we'll be looking at in the future that are also competing for the same spaces, and to thank everyone at the Rockefeller Institute that has been working with me on this and giving me feedback. I look forward to chatting with everyone.
Thank you so much, Kaitlin. Again, just to remind everyone, we'll hold the Q&A to the end, but if you do have questions, please do pop them into the Q&A function so that I can circle back to them when we get to the group discussion portion of the event. Next up then we have Adam Howell, who is the Marketing and Communications Manager at New York State LTAP Center at the Cornell, with the Cornell Local Roads Program. And he will be presenting Uncovering Innovations Developed by Local Transportation Agencies in New York State, the Build a Better Mousetrap competition. So you can take it away, Adam.
All right, is everything looking okay?
Looks great.
Okay, I always want to check. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. Thank you to the Rockefeller Institute for giving me the opportunity to speak to everyone today about what a unique and pretty interesting competition / program that we run here through the Cornell Local Roads Program called the Build a Better Mousetrap competition, focused on innovation and creative problem solving throughout New York State, undertaken by local highway and public works agencies. To give a little bit of context about who we are, in case you aren't familiar with the Cornell Local Roads Program, we're the New York State LTAP Center, that stands for Local Technical Assistance Program. And we provide training, education, and technical assistance specifically to local highway and public works agencies throughout New York State. There's actually a version of us in every state, Puerto Rico, and one surveying tribal authorities throughout the country. It's a program under federal highways, and in New York State, it's administered by the State Department of Transportation. Our main goal is really to provide or connect our audience with deployable solutions that meet the unique needs of local transportation agencies throughout the state. We want to serve as a resource clearinghouse and really connect folks who wouldn't otherwise have a lot of support and resources with the things they need to do to get the job done. So our focus on innovation really ties into that effort. We understand, and we have understood for many years throughout the country, throughout many LTAPs, that innovation is something that happens quite frequently across a broad spectrum of ideas in the local transportation space throughout the nation. We've known this for years. There's a lot of factors that many folks might imagine that contribute to the innovative and creative problem solving happening at local agencies. Of course, a lack of resources, aging infrastructure, there's high level of service expectations, and the variety of work that's being done. COVID-19 being a very prominent example where essential workers needed to maintain their services for their community. These pressures all come together to lead towards a high level of innovation. But the challenges are that these innovations are not often proliferated beyond the agencies that are doing them. And there's a lot of reasons for that we found. First of all, there's a lot of isolation amongst the different highway agencies throughout the state, especially in rural areas. The work that they do is obviously local, and there's a lot of it. So they don't have time to consider putting together things that share these innovations with others. The other thing is that there's a culture shift that needs to occur. These individuals see that the innovative problem solving that they're doing as something that is regular in the course of their work. They don't see it as something as necessarily that innovative. We tend to use terms like innovation as buzzwords surrounding like high-tech innovations, the private sector, research institutions, things like that. And that can sometimes pass over those local elements that are really doing creative work that can be transmitted to others. So in identifying the fact that innovation is occurring quite frequently, we identify that there are benefits for providing a venue to exchange these ideas with others. Obviously, there are the more obvious benefits with regards to the goals that we have: cost savings, operational efficiencies, things that have to do with overcoming obstacles shared by many departments, increasing safety, things of that nature. We also want to collect this information so that we can understand systemic problems that are happening throughout the state. For instance, if there are solutions that are being implemented in similar fashion to address problems in different departments that have no relation to one another, we get to understand a broader picture that there's something more systemic that is challenging departments throughout the state. And perhaps in our role as an LTAP center, we can come forward and provide other solutions ourselves. We want to encourage a culture of innovation. We want to provide recognition to facilitate that. These individuals and departments are doing incredible work on behalf of their local communities, and we want to facilitate those communities understanding that. And then, of course, disseminating these ideas to the wider community helps, again, establish that culture of innovation, but also helps build on good ideas. People evaluating other people's solutions structurally just starts to build on one another. So the Build a Better Mousetrap competition, it may have somewhat of a silly name, but it's got a very serious purpose. And that is some of the things I mentioned before, to share solutions, in our own program, to provide a central venue and a structure that makes it easy for other people to share solutions, and to incentivize them to share these ideas and innovations with others. One of the ways we provide incentives, we house all of these innovations on our website, so they're publicly available. We present the awards and all of the entries in our annual School for Highway Superintendents. This is the largest conference in the state every year for local highway and public works agencies. There's over 750 superintendents that attend. So peer recognition. We put out press releases. We write letters of commendations to the boards and mayors of the departments. And all of this builds to provide a good incentive for people to continue to provide entries. We want to establish a library, so to speak, of housing these innovations over time. And also in certain cases, we'll go further and actually help others implement ideas that were submitted to us. So you'll see in a later slide how we go ahead and make things easier for others to implement solutions. So the competition is very simple. Entries are accepted from November to mid-March. And again, like I mentioned before, we feature all the entries and the winners at our annual highway school here in Ithaca every June. Some of the criteria: they must be submitted by local agencies. We do not accept entries by private industry. They must be developed in-house. They could not have hired somebody to come in and do this for them. Beyond that, we try to make things as easy as possible. We will take what we're given. Ideas are the focus. So however they come in, we try to encourage people to provide cost and development specifics. We try to encourage people to submit high quality photos and video. But again, we take what we can get so we can share what we have. Our program director, Dr. David Orr, he and our chief technical assistance engineer, Jeff Scott, they score the entries along with our advisory panel of 13 to 15, depending on the year, professionals, local government folks and academics who make up our advisory panel. It's a very simple rubric, low cost implementation, whether it solves a problem and whether it's transferable. And over the years, we've had a lot of success. 34 entries in 5 years. When we zoom out and we look at the scope of other states that are doing these competitions, which there are other states, other state LTAP centers that do them, 34 entries is very good. And some information you can glean from this already is that the vast majority of our entries come from towns. You might think that cities, larger metro areas, counties, those entities that have more resources or more staff would be the drivers, but actually it's the smaller units of government, the smaller highway departments that actually submit the most entries. And that's interesting because they're doing the most creative sort of problem solving. And we think that has a lot to do with the sort of pressures and variability of their work. We're going to see if this video plays. I don't have time to show everybody every detail of every entry, but I put together a nice little, hopefully, montage video with the obligatory inspirational music that hopefully gives you some idea here. So we'll try this out and see if it works.
Highway Department here in Perry, New York, and this is my invention.
Then after that, I do the polishing, which you can see here next, and the end result will be what you're going to see in the very last picture, which is my truck, which I take great pride in.
So again, forgive the music. I plan on using that in our marketing in future years, but it shows you a good amount of the sort of passion and heart that goes into a lot of what these folks do, and some of the ways that they're being creative and solving a lot of problems. So moving on, we actually also do our competition in tandem with a national competition run by the Federal Highway Center for Local Aid Support. It's a bit more structured, but we enter some entries from New York into this national competition every year. You can see the categories that they have, and then they have a little bit more stringent judging criteria, but the winners at the national level, they're featured in Transportation Research Board meetings. They get a national venue at several other events, webinars and whatnot. And it gives an even broader ability for states to share nationally what's going on at the local level. And we've had a lot of success in New York since we started the competition in 2018. In 2018, when we first started, the City of Beacon Highway Department, they won first place in a category for the innovative project category. You can see their innovation is a mobile confined space simulator, which is a really creative type of device that allows them to take mobile confined space training and share it throughout their communities. Fire departments use this, different highway departments throughout the area. And then in 2020, we won first place overall. The Town of Niles Highway Department, for the development of their beaver pipe cage. It's a very simple device. It's very transferable, but it prevents debris buildup and makes for easy cleaning of culverts whenever beavers try to build dams there. It's actually a very big problem, not just in New York, but throughout the country. And this won first place overall, where the Town of Niles was featured nationally for this idea. And once again, we went ahead and tried to facilitate the distribution of this innovation throughout the country by developing plans so that others can download it. I want to credit our lab manager, Nick Huesmick, there for having put those together. And then, of course, just a few other highlights. We have learned throughout the years that there's some challenges in maintaining guide rail throughout the state. There were 4 departments in 2019 that submitted different innovations completely in isolation to address this problem. The Washington County Safety Days is another example of a great idea that's spread throughout the state. It's a 2-day training developed by Phil Spezio that trains every public works and highway person in the county on safety training on a variety of topics. And this is actually spread to several other counties. Just some interesting entries over the years. The Village of Warwick maintains a ice skating pond, and they built their own Zamboni. The town of Ramapo, they brine their own sidewalks, which is a more environmentally friendly way of removing ice and snow from sidewalks. And the town of Hamburg actually has their own self-made database for tracking constituent concerns. Real quick, moving forward into the future, We are moving back into in-person events. So our highway school, which is the big event where we feature these innovations, will be held in person this year, which we're looking forward to. We're looking forward to broadening the culture and perspective out there amongst the local highway community about what innovation is. We know that COVID-19 spurred a lot of health and safety innovations amongst these departments. We're hoping to hear more about that, and really just continue to foster this program and develop it so that we can continue to develop a culture of innovation throughout the state, which is a primary goal. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for giving me the opportunity. Once again, you can see all of the entries over the years on our webpage. Just type in Cornell Local Roads Program into Google, and we have the Build a Better Mousetrap webpage. The Center for Local Aid Support Build a Better Mousetrap website is also available online, and you can contact us as well if you know of anyone who has a creative solution or an innovation that might fit our competition. So thank you so much. I'll be happy to take questions at the end, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Adam. That was a really great presentation. Okay, so our next presentation this morning, and again, just a reminder, if you have questions for any of the presenters, you can go ahead as they're presenting and drop them in the Q&A, and we'll circle back to those at the end. So our next presentation this morning is by April Roggio, who is a research associate at the Center for Policy Research at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at the University of Albany. And she is sharing today some preliminary results of her ongoing research on transforming the regional food shed, an investigation of food system localization efforts in New York municipalities. Whenever you're ready, April.
Hi, Lisa. Can you hear me and see those okay?
We absolutely can.
Awesome, great. This will be the only pretty slide today. It's always such a thrill to come here, and Kaitlin always does such fantastic slides, and Adam had a video. So this is it for today, you guys. This is as pretty as it gets. Thank you to the Rockefeller Institute for hosting this gathering. I'm April Roggio. I'm a scholar with the Center for Policy Research at the University of Albany. I either coordinate or am the ringleader of a number of other scholars, and our team is focused on building vibrant and resilient communities. And that begins with their food systems. So these days, my team consists of Luis Luna-Reyes and Elliot Rich. They're both from UAlbany. They lead our system dynamics modeling efforts, among other things. We also have Alex Boone-Tuev, who is in UAlbany's geography program, and he leads our spatial analysis work. Jason Evans is familiar to actually a number of people probably on this call today. He is our subject matter expert in food systems. He brings with him a long history of governance of local food systems from production through consumption. He was at SUNY Cobleskill, but he is now Dean of the School of Food Innovation and Technology at Johnson & Wales University in Rhode Island. I'm happy to say that our newest member of our team is Mary Ehrenberg. She is a newly appointed soil scientist at SUNY Cobleskill. She's trained in Iowa. We're thrilled she's going to be contributing to our efforts to measure conservation agriculture, among other things. And she's collaborating on efforts to better understand how soils are predictive of healthy local ecosystems, but also resilient local food systems. And these days, thanks to our the project I'm going to be talking to you about today, we have 2 additional UAlbany students who are assisting us on projects. So Bom-Gyim Cho is a public administration doctoral student who's working on this, and as is Jamie DeFeo, who's in a master's program in geography. So what are we doing? I thought the best way to approach this is to briefly let you know what papers and projects we're doing, and then let you know what the preliminary research is on our New York State Health Foundation project. So our work and the scholarship, I guess, that we focus on is maybe one piece or one fractal of research into a broader problem. And that broader problem is frequently called many things. So when we want to sound like really smart, we can call it climate change research. We often call it coupled human natural systems research. We work in the food, energy, water nexus. Some folks call it socioeconomic or socioecological system studies today. We could do it through co-production. We could say we're studying polycentricity. And we do a lot of that stuff, but lately it actually feels more important to be more blunt than that. So, and use less rhetoric, I guess. So we are trying to understand the conditions for survival, right? The triggers for some sort of transformation in our food systems. And we usually get there through a portal called food systems, because frankly, that doesn't scare anybody, right? We can talk about it and it doesn't compel people to defend themselves. It doesn't do things like draw the ire of political factions. It's just food, right? And it's, we all need it. How we produce it, how we distribute it, how we consume it, it actually matters a lot, right? And more than ever, I think that this work of securing sustenance, and that's part of what I'm talking about here today, is the work of the people, right? And it's the work of people and their places and their communities. So here's an example of a slide that I love that probably the rest of the world doesn't necessarily, right? It's not necessarily very pretty. So what have we been doing to figure out these things? And I spoke a bit about this last year during this talk as well. From a big picture perspective, the question of what makes for a successful food system has always been our primary question. But from early on, we've realized that there's just not a lot to go on, and that hasn't really changed. Earlier this year, we published a review in the Journal of Cleaner Production. It considers scholarship that addresses the governance of local food systems. And we utilize this model up here that I'm showing you. This is the Ensel and Gash Collaborative Governance Framework. And we like the fact that if you stare at the middle of it, it's actually a feedback loop, right? Commitment to process contributes to shared understanding, to intermediate outcomes. And there's a trust building cycle that happens. I think these days you could also reasonably argue that the success or failure of those iterative cycles of collaboration actually hold the potential of building better, more leadership, which is at the bottom there. And it actually feeds back into the kinds of institutional design that we're interested in. And I guess you could also argue, I think this is true, that last decade's outcomes necessarily impact the starting conditions of new attempts. And I think this is pretty important. So our literature review was guided by the main question, what are the topics in collaborative governance that are present in the literature on local food systems? So our insights are that there are few starting conditions, right? And this is sort of shocking to us. There was little scholarship devoted to understanding the ways in which the history of a place affects those being governed. And this in particular, I think, is really interesting because first, we're these days like super hyper aware of how deeply injustice and inequality impacts a people, right? And second, because there are so many of us that are from these local places. They have a history, they have a shared culture. It shapes who we are, what we believe, and how we tell the story of where we want to go. And to say it in the language of scholarship, it has a lot to do with things like social capital, right? And it goes a long way in explaining, particularly in rural regions, why so many people feel left behind. There was also very little in the literature about the kinds of leadership that facilitates collaborative governance in local food systems. Rarely were outcomes measured. So even when the rest of that system was working really well, trust in small wins, even when there were supportive institutions, we rarely measure the impact of those efforts. And so we don't have much guidance on what the trajectory is telling us. I wanted to say a little bit about this, and this always eats up too much of the time I have with you today, but this is another paper that we published this year. It's a review of participatory guarantee systems. PGS projects are organic certification schemes. So think of them as like the opposite of the big third-party certification programs that identify which products are organic and what production practices, for example, they're using. Those larger ones tend to be cost prohibitive for small growers. PGS projects have evolved as sort of an alternative certification program. And they do interesting things. They manage their own local markets. They build relationships with consumers. They provide training and education for participants. they're often guided by agroecological principles, something that we were particularly interested in. So what conditions might we expect these kinds of PGS projects to find support in the US? We wanted to know that, right? So based on our review of the literature, we concluded those things, that they're only going to happen here if they're economically viable, and that's because the economy in the US drives our behavior. And only if there are incentives and regulations that support innovation, and not just innovation for large industrialized agriculture, right? Innovation for small farms, and only if consumers demand change. But frankly, it isn't clear to us that consumers, or any of us really, are able to identify what good policy in food looks like to begin with. And it will only happen, lastly, if farmers want it to happen. Because that's what we learned from our studies, and this is mostly in the global South, maybe a bit in China, but that was it, right? So farmers are the ones who are driving these particular projects. So what do we do with that knowledge? I think this work has forced us to reckon with how and when locally based food movements might happen here. It compelled us to think about the myriad of ways that we've restricted, and this is important, I think, right now, the ways we've restricted small local experimentation for the purpose of pushing boundaries of what's possible. So in many ways, it deeply influenced the project that I'm going to share with you next. And one last thing for context, these projects, they have a research problem, definitely, but they're also about bridging sciences. So to steal from NSF, right, we're attempting in many ways to create convergence research. Alex Buntua, who's our geographer, is working on trade-offs and synergies embedded in these policy choices. Mary Ehrenberg has us working on phosphorus. We have a history of phosphorus regulation in New York State. And how has that impacted not only farmland and soil management, but how has it impacted the way we're engaging in development? How has it impacted eutrophication in suburban areas? So this is the project we're currently working on. So actually, this might be my ugliest slide. I need pictures or something. But right now, what we have learned is that we need to investigate what food system localization looks like in New York State municipalities. So we've engaged in this project thanks to New York State Health Foundation, so we can clearly identify which projects, which practices, and which policies are being addressed. So, and we want to do it on a particular scale, right? So what we really want to know is how towns are addressing this issue of food. Because it's either a grand challenge or or maybe a wicked problem, depending on what your current level of despair is. But it represents a kind of harbinger of how we might address other near-term calamities. So I think generally we scholars have an obligation to understand first what is, and that's kind of what we're doing now, and for whom. And with regard to what is, we need to understand the state of the land, the state of our people, all of them, and the state of our ability to govern ourselves during times of these cascading crises. So the who, as I've mentioned, is necessarily town supervisors. And how we're going to do this might be of interest to you as well. We're particularly interested not only in convergence research, but also in the ways we're attacking this problem. So you're probably familiar with triangulation. It's often cited as a way, particularly when using qualitative data, of verifying things. So for our work in this study, we're using different data sources. So qualitative interview data, it's followed up by survey data. We're using demographic data from census, from USDA. We're using different scholars. So for example, there's 4 of us doing interviews right now, doing the field work. There's theory triangulation, because different scholars are bringing different theories. My background is public administration and policy. My colleagues hail from natural resource economics. They come from geography and planning, from information science, and they all bring different theories. And perhaps my favorite is the methodological triangulation. So we're doing interviews, we're doing surveys. The survey is going to be informed by what we learn in those interviews. And we're linking it with participatory mapping and participatory modeling whenever we can. So some very preliminary results. This map is based on work done by our geographer. Those blue spots are where we've identified farms. So this is an early map. In the future, we're hoping to identify patterns of where we have agriculture. So we're generally planning to interview a lot of town supervisors and a number of other key stakeholders. So far, we started in the end of January. So our N is very small so far, but interviews are going to be used to complement this survey as well. They're going to inform it, and that's slated to come out this summer. And that's going to include all 932 towns in New York State. And at the same time, this is the map that Alex has created. So interestingly, right, what have we learned? Even at this early preliminary period in this project, I think that this Rachel Carson quote is of particular importance here. She said, "In nature, nothing exists alone." So we're nature too, right? And our relationships to each other, to the ecology, and with the infrastructures that we've created, they're evolving and they're also essential. So we begin interviews by asking questions that help respondents actually tell us about their food systems. We start with consumption. So for example, where do members of your community usually get their food? Has it become easier or harder to access food? What about the locations of those food stores? Interestingly, when a respondent begins, it's also very instructive. So some start by answering those questions to us by explaining the fraction of their population who do not have adequate access to food. They like to provide a lot of details about the expense of food, how far it is for residents to travel, who's likely to need help but refuse to accept help. Others, though, focus on what stores are available, what efforts have been made to help with new retail startups. And frankly, others confess that they've really not given food much thought at all in their municipalities. We also ask them about production. What are the characteristics of food producers in your community? What are their main products? Are there many direct-to-consumer sales venues, like on-farm sales? Are there other actors, entrepreneurs, for example? And the rural town supervisors that I've spoken with are often eager to talk about producers, right? They can often list off who is farming, what they produce, what they've purchased. The value of interviewing governance at this level is frequently like the richness of the narrative. You get to hear their stories, and they can tell you things like where farms were, where they are now, where the most well-managed farms are, who lost their shirt trying to raise beef. These are the sorts of things that they know about. We also ask about distribution. So is there an initiative in your community that helps local producers find additional markets? Are there local food aggregators that work with producers in your area? And this section actually elicits the least feedback. So there's little awareness of how well producers are doing in aggregate. So they can tell us stories, but frequently they're not really aware of how the farming community is doing in their region. And they don't really have a good idea of the access to markets. There's little awareness of the existence of food aggregators, for example. And then we ask about food projects and policies. Food projects frequently exist, but they come in a lot of different forms. So as I mentioned earlier, when you ask about food projects, some assume that you mean food security. So they talk about safety net programs. Others, on the other hand, they want to tell you about their experiences with the local businesses. They may be entrepreneurs. Others simply don't see a need to engage in food systems projects at all. We asked about the future of their local food system, both the one they hope to see and the one they expect. And most, I should tell you, are tentatively optimistic. I'll find that the idea of policy development, though, from the purpose of food system study is overwhelming. They're frequently perplexed by my question, what does policy mean in this context? So what might be next? We're wondering if there might be patterns, some way of identifying places that are particularly successful in nurturing their food systems. One reality is that because town supervisors, particularly rural ones, aren't paid well, means that they are different than their urban and suburban counterparts. They're often retired, for example, or they're established in their own professions well enough to be able to spend some of the extraordinary amounts of time that some of these folks put in to running a town. That said, it also means that those who are in positions are there because of this many decade commitment to a place. And despite that, there's this gap in capacity that I think we need to acknowledge, a gap in knowledge, a gap in resources. And sometimes that gap we have found is filled with volunteers, right? So committees, advisory boards. But when it isn't, towns simply operate at minimum necessary thresholds. So I frequently say the bills are getting paid, the checks are written, but policy per se isn't really happening. And if there is regional or state level guidance, it rarely filters down to town supervisors. So I would say, and I'm almost done, Lisa, I'm sorry. So the metaphor of an ecology of governance continues to be useful here, even if it's a bit of an overused metaphor. Because there's an ecology of everything these days. But on one hand, the micro world of a town frequently doesn't require things like collaboration. One recently told me, April, we're all just like fourth graders on the playground, which made me laugh. But on the other hand, collaboration could also be conceived as a tool sort of like supporting healthy soils in agroecology, right? So if we were to value these places more, wouldn't we figure out a way to pay town supervisors, for example, as regular public service professionals? And we wonder too, if we valued rural places as vital pieces of a healthy and successful food shed specifically, wouldn't we provide the social infrastructure to support their ability to do collective problem solving? And some seem keenly aware of the possibilities of this, insisting that the level of the town, you must always, and this was sort of inspiring. He told me you must always identify the problem by talking to those you are representing. Gather people, talk to them, get them together. And once you have a grasp of that problem, then you find the resources. And that frequently includes building relationships with other legislators in the county at the state level, with regional nonprofits, with the local business community. But then, when I ask about the logistics of that, who are these people? How do you get them to get along? How do you manage the process? At least one sort of reads me, and said, "Oh, April, I know where you're going with this." And yeah, some of them voted for Trump, but that's okay for this, because all we really want is a store back in our town. So I'm going to leave you with this. I'm not going to read it because I think I'm out of time and Lisa's going to kill me. But I'm going to leave you with this. This was written by Joy Harjo. She's serving her third term as U.S. Poet Laureate. She wrote this. She's also a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation. To those who would govern. It's not really a poem, but it's inspiring, I think. Each of the sentiments that have been expressed here have been expressed in our interviews so far. So some, I should point out, are just expressed in passing. Some you will hear, and hopefully I'll be able to give you like audio clips in the future, but some you hear with passion and conviction. And sometimes they represent this like kind of long hardened commitment to a place. And sometimes they're saying these things like it's an epiphany. But I'm going to leave you with this. These sentiments give me hope. And I hope that these early results give you some cause to optimism in what are, I think, objectively dark times. Thank you so much for listening. And I look forward to sharing full results sometime soon.
Thank you so much, April. Again, if you have questions, please leave them in the Q&A and we'll return to them at the conclusion of our last presentation. So next we have presenting Terri Matthews. She is the Director of Town and Gown, New York City Department of Design and Construction. And her co-presenter today is Mark Reiner, Director of Resilient Infrastructure at Jacobs. And they are here to present on Smart Cities Are Built on Smart Foundations.
Hi, thank you very much for this opportunity to present the work of the Town and Gown Utilidor Working Group. I'm the director of the program. Mark Reiner is in the Utilidor Working Group. He's one of our most active members, and we want to talk today about what we're doing in this space. We've been at Rockefeller for the last 4 years. It's a great program. We presented on Town and Gown the program itself. First, it's an innovative university community partnership. We're an action research program. We bring together academics and practitioners to create knowledge Um, so we're always available if anybody's interested in replicating Town and Gown in a cluster of universities and governments across New York State. The last 2 times we presented on, started out as the Construction Demolition Waste Working Group, which became the Urban Resource Recovery Working Group. When I got the invitation, I thought, well, we should try something else. And so today we're going to talk about the Utility Working Group. I call it, we're trying to figure out the right name for it. So I guess today it's the Smarter City Working Group. Town and Gown, we started in 2009. And when you look at issues with the roadway, and it was great to see somebody else refer to the right of way. It's so, because this is what we're talking about. Anything having to do with the surface, you just get under the surface, especially in a dense urban environment. So we've been focusing on this. Actually, it's not 2001, it might be 2011. We created the working group in 2019. We started creating working groups across all different issues because we wanted to take the research cycles and move them into action. And so we've been doing things. And today we'd like to talk about 2 experiential learning projects. And Mark will talk about the bigger, well, you're up next, Mark.
Okay. I think you got feedback on your end there, Terri.
I'm gonna go mute.
Okay. So thanks everybody. Pulling up the cover of one of the last great resilient reports from the 100 RC on Boston, and to point out the introductory letter from, at the time, Mayor Marty Walsh, now Secretary of Labor Martin Walsh. But just to point out what they were looking for in this report. Addressing the most serious shocks such as extreme weather events, so those acute hazards, but also chronic stresses such as aging infrastructure. And at first glance, I bet you most of you would say, like, of course, you got to deal with aging infrastructure. But my question is why? Well, what is a chronic stress of aging infrastructure when engineers don't use age as their criteria? We don't pave roads when they're old. We pave roads when they're cracked or potholes. So everything is condition based. If you're looking at it from a utility, we have 130, 140, 150-year-old water mains because the utility has done a condition assessment and said, hey, we probably get 10 more years out of it. Brooklyn Bridge is 150 years old. The Charles Bridge in Prague is 625 years old. So we have to understand there's a big difference between when we say aging infrastructure and what the engineers who run our infrastructure are actually thinking. So what is a chronic stress? And this is actually one of the major missing pieces of urban resilience, is defining chronic stresses of aging infrastructure. And it's so missing that nowhere else in this report, except at the bottom of page 128, is aging infrastructure mentioned again. And it just tells you, hey, there's a 311 number you can call and complain about aging infrastructure. So it was up there in the beginning of one of the major things to look at. Of course, they talked about aging transit, but aging infrastructure, what are those chronic stresses? So what Terri and I are working on with the utility group is actually looking at the foundation of our cities. And how do we move from a aging, or as President Biden calls it, crumbling infrastructure to a resilient foundation? And this is part of the city we have, the city we want type of mantra. So we're looking at aging infrastructure from the city's point of view, not from the utility. There has to be a duality of conversation here between what the utilities are saying and what the mayor, city manager, senior planners are saying about their city, because we have a dumb paradigm of how we place our urban infrastructure. And it begins at the foundation. So you can see, unless you have a giant, and of course this is obtained from a New York Times article, which was a great one by Shoshana Sachs, and unless we have a giant that can actually pick things up and do proactive maintenance, that's just not our paradigm. And so this is from a public works director friend of mine that he stays up at night because he knows he's putting in a 100-year infrastructure and his budget is for a 500-year replacement cycle. So why is that? And so why don't we talk about aging infrastructure and the stresses of it? Because we tend to think surface up, and that's where we're coming at. So as Terri mentioned, we're thinking surface now when we're talking infrastructure, where utilities are buried. So they're thinking below ground. And when it's out of sight, out of mind, we don't think about aging infrastructure, right? So below our streets are everything we need to have a city maintain its viability. Everything is going on below the streets of our city, and it's out of sight, out of mind. And if it's working, it's great. It's safe, and taxes are being collected, and there's a sense of well-being, and a young family can push their kid in a stroller across light rail tracks. But look at all that infrastructure there, above ground, below ground, on the surface, etc. If anything goes wrong, a lane is closed, a road is closed, disruptions are happening. When there's disruptions, there's travel delays, congestion, accidents, air pollution. You're starting to disrupt local businesses, so you're losing revenues, etc. So how do we quantify this? These are the stresses of aging infrastructure. So in New York City, the roads are cut open 550 times per day. And if you're in any city in any town USA, we're just inured to this. Of course, there's a lane closed, there's construction, but it's happening all the time. And there's ramifications, not just in delays in travel and congestion, but every time you cut open into asphalt, that's a pathway for water to seep in northern climates like in New York State. And salt, that's what accelerates potholes, which accelerates the road budget. Despite robust asset management and highly technical people behind our water systems, we still have 720 water main breaks per day in the United States because we can't access and be proactive maintenance in this paradigm. And, you know, it's just kind of a frog in boiling water parable. 2,000 miles of water mains in Los Angeles exceed recommended service life per American Water Works Association. 2,000 miles under our streets is a significant discussion. So I just want to point out this duality of how we look at infrastructure and just point to how engineers look at, you know, the safety or reliability of their infrastructure. So I'm using water and a key performance indicator here that all North American water utilities use this, that if you have 15 breaks or fewer per 100 miles of your transmission distribution line per year, you're considered best practice per American Water Works Association. If you have less than 15, you're doing great. More than 15, time for course correction, you're on the road to a crisis. Engineers love this, right? It's 15 per 100 miles. I get it. Done. But think about, I'm juxtaposing the first 3 sentences from the water section of the last ASC report card, and I challenge you to read it. The first 3 sentences of the water section. Paraphrase that there's 2.2 million miles of underground pipes that deliver safe and reliable water to millions of people. There's a water main break every 2 minutes. That's at 720 per day. So an engineer wrote this, right? 720 water main breaks per day, right next to the sentence that it's safe and reliable. From one perspective, the engineer is like, well, we have system redundancy and we respond to patches quickly. So of course you can have safe and reliable water. But think about from a city manager, a mayor, a senior planner, business owners, commuters in the city, each one of those water main breaks, 720 a day is a disruption. So there's a duality perspective here that you can say it's a safe and reliable system, 721 water main breaks per day, but each one of those water main breaks is a disruption somewhere and patches to the road and lanes close, etc. So I'll turn it back over to Terri. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. So I'm going to talk briefly about the first project. It's actually 2 projects with Columbia SEPA capstone program. We're starting from the premise that the utilidor, which is a system of systems infrastructure into which the utility pipes would go, the public and private, that is the solution for the problem of not being able to get to your subsurface infrastructure for proactive state of good repair. This is our starting point. Just as background, The first picture, very famous. This is when we had telephony and electricity above ground, blizzard of 1888. All of a sudden we went, oh, we got to put that underground. This is an example of what they call the subsurface spaghetti problem. When we replace it, we have to take everything out. And you can see that. This is the only time you can really see what's going on under the ground. And then once we close it all up, you can't see it. It's invisible. But very often, and this is a problem, and it may be a problem in other urban areas in the state, you fix a road, try to get the private utilities to do their stuff when you've got the road open. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. You got a beautiful street, and then 6 months later, they're back in fixing their own stuff. The utilidor solution, and this is the famous Paris system, it's a corridor into which everything can go. And so for a dense urban old city, the question about how do you you move from the current direct burial to this modern system that makes sense is you gotta, and go to the next slide. It's like, you gotta look at the cost benefits, because if you're trying to make this argument for a local government such as New York City and the utilities that work, that have their services in New York City, it's got to make sense from a direct cost basis long term. So in 2020, we had students from Columbia SEPA develop a life cycle cost benefit model, and they did a fabulous job. And they showed a really, really big cost benefit over cost. It was so big, it just seemed a little unrealistic. So our working group went through their model, made a bunch of comments. And so 2 years after, this spring, we have another series of Columbia SEPA capstone students revising it, reflecting the work, comments from the working group. They're also going to be, so that this work is underway, and maybe next year we'll present on that. And the other piece that everyone talks about, it's in the literature, is once you have access to your stuff, which we don't have now, and this is the smart city piece, because everybody says smart city this, smart city that, but you can't have a smart city if your stuff is in the dirt and you can't get to it. You can start censoring, you can start doing proactive remote monitoring. So these students, and then I'm going to stop talking, they're actually doing a life cycle cost benefit model, assuming utilidors. What are the other benefits and how does that work out? And then Mark is going to talk about another fabulous project that we did in the fall.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, so we're just building up a foundation of evidence and reasons why chronic stressors of aging infrastructure would lead to a project like this. And so this, we had NYU Tandon School of Engineering develop a surface data project that I'll kind of go over real quick. And the question was, what kind of existing city data exists to support the idea that there's chronic disruptions? This is part of that chronic aging infrastructure stressors, right? And so there's tons of data. And so they developed a methodology, well, it's called LAMP. So it's locate, analyze, measure, and prioritize. But it goes through what data exists. Do we understand it? Does it fit into the category? So there's like 311 data, tons of data. But do we say graffiti complaints? Does that show us where disruptive infrastructure is? Not necessarily. So there has to be a methodology that we take this data, we extract it, and it's almost like that DIKW pyramid where you go from data, information, knowledge to wisdom. How do we use this data to inform our decisions? And so after a capstone of last semester, they finalized at the end of December last year, they developed a dashboard based on different data sets where the disruptions were occurring, and they used Manhattan as their example. But the idea for LAMP is that it's a methodology that could be applied to Duluth, Minnesota, Clear Lake, California, so all over the country. And the idea here is, let's start now building up a data set of where disruptions are occurring and why. What we've just submitted to the University of Toronto, so it's proposed to build on this, is now how do we get into what a community actually needs in terms of a CapEx or a capital expenditure priority. So this is just fictitious right now. What I'm going to show you is the set of circles. So if you live in Manhattan or Brooklyn, I'm just throwing circles out there. So these are all fictitious. But the idea for NYU's LAMP project was, let's take subsurface vulnerabilities. That's kind of what I do at Jacobs. But now add unplanned, so accidents and 311 data. Where are we finding disruptions? Planned work, where Public Works or DOT taking out permits for lane and road closures. But now building up from the community, there's plenty of community assessments out there, but it always says, find your data. And what is the condition of the water mains? And it's ridiculous. I mean, cities have to have this compendium of what spatial information should a community know or have access to. Like, are they a food island desert? Do they have to walk across things they already know, but do they have to walk 6 lanes of traffic to get to school? Would they be benefited by easier access to other economic opportunities? So University of Toronto is kind of taking the social aspect as a bolster to a lot of great social values work, right? But they're starting to look at what kind of data can we use? How do we start to identify community capital needs and planning and identification of specific capital needs? So this hasn't started yet. So we have a more of a rigorous methodology we're asking them to create if we get accepted here. But the overall idea is now to build this data set of infrastructure vulnerabilities, disruptions, but also community needs to put together an overall holistic package for defining where utilidors should be. So I'm going to end it there. I think we're under our 15 minutes, maybe, hopefully. So I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for those really fascinating presentations. So now we're going to move to some group Q&A. I'm going to invite all the panelists, if you're comfortable, turning on your videos. And also to please feel free to jump in and respond to the questions or to follow up or offer observations in response to one another. So we did have just 1 or 2 questions or comments that came in during the Q&A. So let me start with those. The first one was for Kaitlin, and this is from Dr. Warner, who will be presenting later today at a later panel. She said this was a very fascinating presentation, Kaitlin, and she had a couple questions for you. For food production in the right-of-way, what about pollution from the road? On haying, how would a tractor get there and a hay wagon get off the highway? What about crops that attract deer? And then she mentioned that this has happened in Pennsylvania, and they switched back to grass after the plantings attracted deer to graze in the right-of-way. Last question she had was, what about charging for cell towers, underground cables, etc.?
Thanks, Lisa, for reading that, and thanks, Mildred, for the question. So, okay, first for food production in the right-of-way. Basically, this is so yet uncommon that there really is no data on this for rights-of-way in particular. So the data that we have comes from transmission rights-of-way. So basically, people who make agreements to use under power line infrastructure, for example. And so there, the safety concerns have been about electromagnetic radiation, for example. So the safety concerns that we could think about in a roadside context would be more about, yes, thinking about runoff in particular. But so again, there are no studies on this right now. One thing I will point out for that pilot, though, that I shared is that it does involve raised beds. And so we see this in other urban farms where the concern is about soil contamination. So for example, I used to live in Wisconsin, and Milwaukee there encourages people having raised beds in particular, in part due to previous industrial contamination. So soil health in particular, I think in general, we'd want people to be thinking about doing testing Or because remember, again, it's public land that wouldn't be owned by whoever is farming, there may be liability reasons that becomes a requirement of who's allowed to use that land and why. For haying in particular, I think you bring up a really good point, which is basically about access. So in that tool I quickly showed from Texas, one of the sort of decision points is this list of 26 questions for basically the state agency to reflect on for any given specific project is basically, do you have good access for your infrastructure to get on and off here? In practice, though, it's pretty similar to thinking about mowers going out. And so oftentimes when mowers are going out to mow in a right-of-way, the infrastructure is brought there and people meet on site, and then their supervisor might actually drive them back. And so they'd be probably adapting processes that people already have for bringing other kinds of equipment into the right-of-way. For crops that are attracting deer, for living snow fences, this would be basically corn that is in many places where these projects are happening, it's the winter. And so the corn is dried down, it's just not harvested. So for the living snow fences, it's not really living in the sense that people or, animals would be eating it in the winter. And I did briefly get to mention that there is a lot of concern about deer in particular. And again, this is an area where people do want to see more research, and in particular, experimental research. But even the Federal Highway Administration has written reports about deer vehicle collisions in particular. And even with the limited research, there's not an indication at scale from experimental studies that we know that putting in these different kinds of plants is actually leading to increased collisions. But I do agree that it is absolutely a concern. And this is why people want more information, is that many people bring this up as saying, if we improve the roadside in these ways, are we going to make it less safe? And certainly state transportation agencies, their priority is safety, right? Safety for motorists, safety for everything that's traveling on the highway. And so absolutely any of these potential innovative uses is still operating under what are not only the regulations, but what's the mission, right? The mission is supporting safe transit on the roadway. And so these innovative uses can't come at the expense of safety. I'll just stop there.
Okay, thank you. April, I just wanted to call your attention. It wasn't actually a question, but Ben Lapham did have a comment that they have a pilot program in urban vertical farming in Glens Falls, mainly supplying greens and vegetables to local residents. So perhaps you two might want to reach out to each other at some point and connect and talk. I do have a couple questions for the panelists. I'll go a little out of order just to mix things up a little bit. Mark, I think I would start with you. I really appreciated your presentation, and I have to confess that I hadn't really thought about what a catch basin that phrase aging infrastructure captures when we talk about municipal stressors. So I realize that your focus is on urban areas, but I'm really, really curious as to what your thoughts are as to whether this is a lesser or a greater problem, maybe in rural areas or smaller mid-sized cities. Which maybe not as your presentation made me think, not as accustomed maybe to the ongoing infrastructure projects, or where maybe the disruption impact isn't quite so ominous. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Do you see your project as a learning example for smaller municipalities? Well,
I'll start at the nation. So Biden says crumbling infrastructure, roads, rails, bridges, water, all that is horizontal infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Americans consume and demand 30 tons of materials per year, per person. None of it originates within a municipality. It all originates from our rural areas, our hinterland, right? So all cities, the resiliency begins at the border of the cities and is connected to aging infrastructure across the nation that itself is subjected to. FEMA has 18 natural hazards that all this is subjected to. So the rural areas are connected to their markets through horizontal aging infrastructure. So there's no decoupling of urban infrastructure from rural infrastructure from interstate infrastructure. So that's why what we're doing is taking a look at specifically sub-block level subsurface vulnerabilities in a city, but also how cities are connected and dependent. So I won't go on because I could, because cities, as they're trying to decarbonize, they're looking at just solar versus fossil fuel. But if you actually look at fossil fuel power plants, like the big one in Colorado here, it's the Comanche 1.4 gigawatt that requires 6 trains of coal from Wyoming every day. At its height, before it started getting decommissioned, it was burning 1.4 million pounds of coal per hour. So there's all this reliance on energy, but we have to have the cities understand where all this energy and food and fuel and materials are coming from. So there's of course a connection across the state, across the country, rural and urban.
Terri, I think you wanted to jump in.
You're on mute.
Yeah.
Okay.
When I suggested this, I was thinking about its relevance to other places in New York State. You have the big 5 cities. You got Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, and I consider Albany. I mean, every city has buried infrastructure. And, the capital budgets, this stuff, routine state of good repair, it gets done, but it doesn't get done at the levels that it really does need to be done. And part of the problem is the access to it. To get to it, you have to dig up the streets. The life cycle cost benefit model, just focusing on direct costs. We're not talking about social benefits, any of that. We're just saying you can demonstrate to do a utilidor to provide you with better access. It's maybe twice the cost of direct burial. It's probably higher in New York than in Albany. And everybody talks about smart cities. It's like, I can't get over it. It's like, do you have any idea what you're talking about? Because the IBMs are, I don't know, it's like magic. I mean, the roads are supposed to do, the interconnected vehicles, the electric charging. There are materials that can be in the road surface to charge cars. If you keep digging up the roads, that just doesn't work. So even cities out, the big 5, and I think it's definitely applicable there. And I also think that, highway roads, rights of way, that utilidors are kind of there already. It's easier to put one there, but so I do think there is applicability to the rest of New York State. And if we can make the case in New York City, where everything is, more expensive, I think eventually, look, they're taking down the highways in the cities, Syracuse, Rochester. It's just going to increase traffic. I just think there's going to be a need for it. So I'm going to stop talking now.
All right, thank you. Back to roads. Adam, I really loved your video presentation and seeing the real faces behind these, policy implementation. I was curious just to hear your thoughts. How effective in your view is the use of these kind of competitive aspects to fostering creative problem solving? And maybe why, aside from fiscal incentives, do these seem to spark the word that you use, passion?
Well, I in terms of the word competitive aspects, I wouldn't say that we focused as much on the competition itself. It's more of just a catalyst to get people to submit things. I would say the biggest driver is sort of pure awareness and peer recognition. The local highway officials throughout the state, they have their own association. They have the county associations, and they're a very tight-knit community when they can actually be around one another. So for them to be able to have us as both a physical and a digital venue to where they can share these things, that has been a major driver of people both thinking about what they're doing on the local level more in terms of how they can be more creative, and also considering the things that they're already doing as possibly being creative and worthy of sharing. And then that's elevated again. The competitive aspect, I would say, comes into play at the national level competition a bit more, because states tend to be a bit more competitive at that level. But again, it's all in terms of positive idea sharing, and this is more of an aspect of discovery than anything else, because of the resource pressures, and all the things I talked about. They're already doing so much of this, and I could only show a snippet today, but there is so much else that's going on out there that's very interesting and intersects with so many of the things that others have talked about this morning already.
Right, and back to that kind of idea sharing, if I could jump back to Kaitlin, you know, Adam's presentation addressed some of those factors affecting innovation at the local level. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about if and how policy diffusion and learning is happening in relation to right-of-way uses. So how are states kind of engaging in that? And how do those private-public partnerships, how do they get developed, or are they able to develop?
Yeah, so I think on the first piece, and to build up on what Adam was just saying, I think it's so exciting, number one, to hear about all the work that his program is doing, because even just to give you an example of what someone like me as a researcher would go to learn about what others are doing, there is an annual meeting, the TRB, that happens every year in DC, and registration for that for one person is $1,000 now. So that's unlikely to be accessible to a lot of local highway folks, or even multiple people from a state or a regional office. So it's really expensive. That's just for the conference registration. And so, of course, especially during the pandemic, that meant that lots of people couldn't participate in that. So any of these kinds of peer exchanges that happen in other spaces that lower those barriers to people learning from each other is so exciting to know about and to foster that kind of collaboration. The Federal Highway Administration, in particular with renewable energy, has actually hosted peer exchanges. So they did a series of these. This was all pre-pandemic, so I don't know what this will look like right now or potentially post-pandemic, that was focused on having people from state departments of transportation, for example, go to Oregon or go to Maryland and actually look at each other's solar infrastructure in particular. And so that particular use, especially in the sort of 2015 to 2018 range, the Federal Highway Administration was trying to help be a facilitator for states from learning for each other. And Oregon actually wrote documents that are for other states to say basically, hey, learn from us. We've been doing this for over 10 years now. But that's where I do think that it highlights some of the things that are different between states, right? So the lessons learned in Oregon have to do with their particular legal context, both in terms of those tax and revenue incentives for what's going to help fund solar that will be different or could be different in other states, can also be different in Oregon in the future. But they're trying to basically give, here's what helped facilitate our success. In the case of Oregon, though, they're very upfront about the fact that this was really a pet project of someone who took the lead and then got the go-ahead from their supervisors. Someone had to be a champion for this, and that's time, right? And that's energy. And there are lots of other competing demands. And as Adam mentioned, especially during the pandemic, I know a lot of the collaborators that I know in state departments of transportation were all of a sudden running testing centers, or all their cones went off to run testing centers. So were really creative things in terms of leveraging state resources, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, but that meant that other things did not happen. So I think that we've seen all these really creative ways that people are especially working on transportation infrastructure and other state needs. But I think that that also really speaks to one of the things that I sort of ran out of time to talk about, which is investing in people. So it was really exciting to hear Adam say that part of that program is about recognizing people. So I was part of a virtual peer exchange that happened in January that was specifically about pollinator habitat. So there are examples of states getting together virtually in this kind of context when they maybe can't meet up together to learn from each other and identify things they want to know more about. But people were really sharing that basically they don't even have the job descriptions. They want to move into these areas. And even if they have people on staff that really would like to do those things or want to gain the expertise, there's not the ways to reward that expertise right now. So for example, when it comes to things like pollinators, that might be about actually identifying plants or learning more about what would make good habitat, or actually, going out and learning how to identify a monarch butterfly. So not only is there not the sort of time or resource right now to let staff go do that, but even if they did, what is going to maintain them and help them develop that career trajectory that actually keeps them and keeps that knowledge in the agency? And so those were some of the things that people identified as being lacking. So it is really exciting to hear that there are at least these spaces that are trying to provide demonstration and even things like awards that can help demonstrate that someone is showing excellence and innovation in their field. But I do hope that as more states want to do much more creative things with their transportation infrastructure in particular, it means really rethinking who a transportation professional is and what kinds of skills you need within that agency to do all this different kind of work.
Thank you. April, if I could return to you, I really appreciate your group's focus on that feedback loop and policy learning and tackling those difficult questions of trying to assess not just the impact of the policies, but the utilization of policy knowledge. I'm wondering if you could just elaborate very quickly, I may have missed it, but in your focus on New York State, why towns, particularly in light of your explanations of kind of the limits of towns in terms of feeling somewhat divorced from regional collaboration? And then finally, do you see your research as a pathway to bridging those gaps?
So why towns is a fabulous question. I think first, why towns? Because if we agree that food is one of those drivers of some of the larger massive problems, food is, we can access local people in that way, right? So it's an access point. And more so, I think these days when we're addressing sustainable development, so much of the conversation has tended to revolve around how we have participatory research. How do we get consumers at the local level to change buying habits? How do we convince them to really care about production practices of agriculture? All of that happens at the level of community. Now, I would also add that there are some limitations to this. You know, some of the key stakeholders that we have had the great honor of speaking to in New York State will address specifically the fact that the towns are underfunded. There's no way to really support the more expansive capacity that a lot of our rural towns need. So it is one of my hopes, and I think that maybe I didn't write down your second question, but with regard to sort of bridging connections, I think one of our hopes is that maybe projects like this can re-envision what the possibilities are for towns. And I say this while pointing out that, you know, I've had interviews with supervisors where I've said, well, like, why does a town exist these days? Maybe it shouldn't exist. Maybe it should devolve upward to the level of the county again. And, you know, sort of sadly, I think some of them agreed that maybe that was the long-term vision. And it's my hope that maybe that's not the trajectory, that maybe if we have more of these conversations, if there's more scholars asking what are the possibilities at a local level, that we can re-envision what a rural town could be and who should be governing it. I'm not entirely sure that a county is the best possible source of governance power in a lot of these rural places. So does that answer both of your questions? I didn't write down quick enough.
No, it does. Thank you very much. We do have the Deputy Director of the Association of Counties presenting later today as well. I see we're almost at time. I did note that in the Q&A, there was a question about the inviting comments from the panelists to talk about innovations in relation to the question of finances. And so I see a couple of you have answered that in the chat. So yeah, so I think that since we are at time, we need to go ahead and wrap up, but I want to thank everyone for just really outstanding presentations today, and the linkages that I think kind of developed between the presentations was really quite delightful for the audience. So thank you everyone for attending. That concludes panel 1. I hope that you will join us in a few minutes. We worked in a few minutes of break between our sessions, but that you will join us for panels 2, Budgetary Crisis and Recovery, and panel 3, Collaboration and Partnerships in Education. Those panels are running concurrently. You can find the links to those panels through your email confirmation of registration or on the website. I know it's difficult to choose because they're great panels, but as a reminder, we'll be posting the recording of the conference later at our website. So you'll be able to access the presentations you missed and the panels that you weren't able to attend in the concurrent sessions just in a few days. So we look forward to seeing you all at the next sessions. And thank you again, everyone, for outstanding presentations.